I'd like to call this meeting of the Bellingham City Council Public Works, Public Safety Committee to order. This morning we have 6 items before the committee. And I believe the first 3 we need to do a different order in terms of relating to contract awards to Moose Boats. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So if you explain what we need to do to make this happen or work.
The 3 ordinances. The 3 ordinances there, we're looking to pass the budget authority first, then the one for the bringing the funds in from the port, and then the third one would be awarding the bid.
Okay, so we do the ordinance first? Was that?
Yes.
Okay. And could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, sorry.
Yes, I know that's.
Bill Hewitt, the Assistant Fire Chief.
Okay, thank you. So that first item that we're dealing with is the ordinance related to the 2014 Fire Department budget for the purchase of a fire rescue boat. And you have any introduction? Anything?
Well, yeah, the city received a port security grant from the Department of Homeland Security, and this is a opportunity for us to use that grant funds along with some matching funds that the port has agreed to purchase a new fire rescue boat for our waterfront fire protection.
Okay. Committee, Michael?
Move approval.
Okay. Jack?
I'll be voting for this to recommend to the committee, but I'll be voting against it tonight in the committee of the whole.
Yeah, I recognize you had objections to the process previous. Okay, all those in favor of the motion, answer aye.
Aye.
Opposed, abstention. We will recommend approval tonight of the order. Yes, Michael.
I just want to comment because it
I'm
may
sorry.
not be clear to the public. This is a $750,000 grant from Homeland Security and then $125,000 each from the port and from the city for a total of $1 million.
Okay. So I believe the next item then is the contract award to Morris Boats for agreement to build a fire rescue boat.
Yeah,
Do we need
I
the
believe we
interlocal
would like
for-
to do the
Okay, I'm
interlocal
sorry.
first, so.
Okay. Actually, the next then is the interlocal agreement between the City of Bellingham and the Port of Bellingham to provide co-matching funds for the Bellingham Fire Department FY 2013 Port Security Grant Program Award.
Yes, and so this is the, it was $1 million total cost that we were looking at for the boat. The grant is a $750,000 grant with a $250,000 matching, and the Port of Bellingham is matching or providing half of that match at the $125,000. This brings that matching funds into the city so we can use them for the expenditure of the boat.
Okay. Committee, Michael?
Move approval.
Okay. All those in,
Wait.
yeah.
I have a question. This has to do with kind of all these together. Right now, the contract for the boat is estimated around $900,000, yet we're setting aside an agreement that has to do with $1 million. So we have a 10% kind of safety cushion. What will happen if, by good fortune, we actually only spend $900,000? How will the contribution from the city, and will we reimburse the port and give back to the grant? I mean, what happens to the difference if we save money?
Want to ask me?
Whoever knows.
You can ask me. Oh, Brian's not gonna let
Actually,
me
Brian
answer.
Hinshaw, Finance Department. Michael, if you look on the first one, since they're out of order, it's a little bit different. It's actually $900,000 plus sales tax. So, and that's $78,000. So we're up to $980,000. So hopefully
mind.
that'll still be the ending price.
I like your wishful thinking, though. Okay. Any other comments, questions? All those in favor of the motion, answer aye.
Aye.
Okay, we will recommend approval of the interlocal tonight. Now, the third item is the contract award to Moose Boats, Inc. for agreement to build a fire rescue boat.
Yeah, so a committee within the fire department did quite a bit of research on different boats that were out there. We explored different purchasing options. We ended up using the federal GSA as an option for purchasing in order to meet the timelines required by the grant. The committee from the fire department did extensive research on the different vendors that were available through there, and Moose Boats was the vendor that came out as the top-notch vendor that was able to work within our budget requirements and able to provide a boat within the timelines required by the grant.
Okay, committee, Michael?
Were there any local, and I mean Western Washington, local boat manufacturers who were part of the GSA list?
No, the two that were on the GSA list were the Moose Boats, which is out of Petaluma, California, and there was Metalcraft, which I'm trying to remember exactly where in, I want to say Ontario, was where the other company was located. And so those were the only two that were on GSA.
Michael?
Also, on page 44 of the packet, section 6 of the contract talks about the completion date. So under contract, they need to provide the work by July 31st, and we have until August 31st to spend the money. That's only like 1 month. And we're cutting it close, aren't we? Was there some discussion with regard to that we have to have the grant spent by August 31st, boat delivery by July 31st? How was that discussed?
Yeah, well, my understanding is, yeah, that being part of the contract, they understand that our funding is tied to their completion of the project on time.
Michael and Matt Stamps, legal department. I was involved in negotiating the terms of the agreement, and I know that our purchasing department has had extensive conversations on that topic. And the contract actually reiterates the importance of that completion date because it's in advance of the funding deadline. If you notice, bottom of page 44, top of page 45, there's actually explicit mention of time being of the essence. And
I know, we
reference to the
used all
grant.
caps, so no one could miss it.
That's right.
I don't think that's legally enforceable. But I do notice section 13 under city's remedy, we do have legal course remedy. I'm actually not concerned with holding them legally liable. I just would rather have the boat on time. How did they feel about the July delivery date? Did they actually say, oh, no, heck, we'll have it to you in June? Or are they planning on July 31st? Do we know?
I could not tell you. I know that they plan on completing it prior to the deadline. Part of the reason, again, we selected this company, though, is because they have a history of being able to perform within the timelines required, and it's a boat that this boat is a boat that they've built before. They've built many of these fire rescue boats before. It's not a company that's wandering into new territory or trying to build something that they don't have a model for. So we're fairly confident that we'll be within the delivery date. But just knowing that the time for build out on all fire equipment, I would be surprised if we get it or a lot earlier than what's the delivery date's anticipated.
Okay. Okay, committee, do I hear a motion?
I'm going to go ahead and move approval.
Okay. Any comments, questions? Okay, we have a motion before. Yes.
I'm sorry, this is, one of the things that's not discussed in this contract or in these documents has to do with operating costs. It's conceptually separate from this, but before I vote for approval on this last point, have we had discussions, or what is our current plan with regard to ongoing operational costs, will the port be sharing in that 50/50 the same way they are with the match, or is there some other arrangement being contemplated?
There was a letter that the port sent talking about a sharing of costs, and we'll be happy to bring that back tonight. And I will check with the port today, but I think the idea was it's our equipment, and we are going to be staffing it. And the idea also was that the port would be, I believe, well, I hate to say anything on camera that I'm not absolutely sure of, but there would be some equal cost sharing, not necessarily splitting the costs in half. So the port has some, something that that they can contribute that would be relatively equal to what we would be contributing, and then there would be a plus cost factor if there was an incident.
Well, part of the reason why this grant was secured through Homeland Security is that this boat will have more than one mission. In addition to firefighting, there's some general security and patrol duties being contemplated for the boat, and those are kind of entirely for the port and not part of our firefighting mission. So that's part of the reason why I think, even over and above the fact that this is extra service the city is providing, there's a component that's even beyond what the city would do, at all.
Well, I would be happy to bring back some more information for you. I don't think I would have a negotiated agreement interlocal with the port prior to tonight when you vote. So if you have some concerns about this life-saving measure, I think that you should potentially wait till you have the questions answered. Otherwise, I believe there's going to be, and have been assured by the port that there's going to be a partnership on the operation and usage of the boat.
I don't need a negotiated cost-sharing agreement, but if by tonight you could give me an indication of rough proportionality, that would be helpful to me.
I think the best thing you could do is read the letter that the port has already submitted to us, and I will review that before tonight, and I will give you any more information that I have at that time. But basically, that's as far as we've gone with the port.
Okay, I'd like to see that letter. Thank you.
You did get a copy.
I may have lost it.
Well, that's not my
Yeah.
fault.
No, not your fault at all.
But,
I
Mayor,
can get that for you,
can you
Carrie.
get him a copy of the letter?
Absolutely, I
Okay,
can get
thank
him a
you.
copy. I'll get you all a copy.
Yes, that would be good, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, do I have a motion?
I think I made one, yeah.
Okay, we have a motion for us. All those in favor, answer aye.
Aye.
Aye. We will recommend approval tonight, and Mayor Kelly, you will try to have someone get us that letter. That would be
Absolutely.
helpful. Thank you very much. End of that item. The next item is a proposed ordinance amending Chapter 1402 of the Bellingham Municipal Code regarding latecomer agreements for street and utility system improvements.
Thank you. Good morning. Ted Carlson, Public Works Department. This is, as Council Member Borneman suggested, there's some revisions to the BMC that governs latecomers. This is being driven by some changes at the state level, but it's also an opportunity to look at the code and clarify some areas that may not have been as clear as we'd like them to have been. Essentially, what the state legislature did was, as it regards to private latecomers, so this is where a private developer either does street improvements or utility improvements and then wishes to regain a portion of those costs through connections from other private development. In the past, it was always voluntary whether or not cities offered to administer that private latecomer for the developer. By practice, the city of Bellingham always has, and our code essentially says that the city will do that, but now it's no longer optional. If a private developer wishes to go through that process, the city must administer that latecomer process. So we'll be making the code revisions in front of you. The ordinance makes those changes to the code. It also clarifies the process itself, and working with Matt Stamps, we put together a memo in your packet that walks through some of these clarifying portions of the code. And it does things like in the previous code, the current code says that anyone that benefits from the utilities that are installed by the developer would be responsible for paying their proportionate fair share. We've always intended that to mean anyone that connects to the utilities, but there are some rare circumstances where you could argue that someone benefits from the existence of the utility. For instance, you can only develop if you fully abut utilities.
Right.
But yet that person may have an opportunity to connect to another sewer main, maybe through an easement to another portion, and not actually connect to the utilities. Under the current code, someone could argue, well, they benefited and they should pay their proportionate fair share. So this clarifies, it says only if you connect to those utilities are you required to pay your fair share. And so there's other things that like that, similar to the process, that have to do with timing, when the latecomer is actually recorded with the assessor, how we deal with the engineering cost estimates, and how we reconcile that with the actual costs that can be legally attributed to the project cost and therefore assessed against people within the benefit area. So I think it's relatively straightforward, and maybe instead of, I can certainly go through the memo point by point, but I don't know if anyone had an opportunity to go through it and may have some questions. Either Matt or myself can answer those. I don't think there's anything really out of the ordinary. Like I said, for the most part, it's clarifying with that one exception that says it's now mandatory. There is also a clarifier in terms of the length of the latecomer itself. We have always used 15 years. We've now clarified that to it's 15 years for street, but 20 years for utility latecomers. And there was a change in the law that it used to be up to, now it's a minimum of 20 years. So we made that change. So like I say, it's fairly routine changes just to get us in bounds with state law, and also really clarify our own process and make it easier for both the folks that want to go through the process, the developers, and also for city staff to understand the process. So,
Jack?
Yeah, it looked pretty clear to me. I vote or move to approve.
Okay.
If I could, I wanted to just clarify one point. Ted did a nice job summarizing. Just one clarification on the mandatory versus optional nature of the city executing a latecomers agreement. Under state law, it's now mandatory with regard to utility improvements. It remains optional under state law with regard to a street improvement. But as Ted mentioned, our code, and in practice, it's always been read, if a developer comes forward with an eligible improvement, the city executes a latecomer. So rather than add a lot of complexity to the code, we've just, this code makes it mandatory for both street and utility, even though under state law, it's only mandatory for utilities.
Michael?
I have a few questions about some of the new material. Section 1402050 on page 71 of the packet, page 6 of the ordinance. I really like seeing explicit decision and review criteria. Are those review criteria actually new, or are we just writing down what we were already doing and now making it explicit? Application review, there's 4 bullet points about what the director or your designee shall review. They seem pretty standard. I just want to know if that's new, or are we just being explicit about old practices?
I'm sorry, I missed this spot.
Where is it again?
Yeah, section 1402050, page 6 of the ordinance,
Take it.
page 71 of the packet.
Yeah, those are what we've already done, just clarifying. There's some clarification there, but that has been the process.
Section 1402110, that's on page 9 of the ordinance, has to do with defective work, that there's up to 1 year if there's defective work installed by the developer, then it's sort of still their responsibility. Older than a year, well, it's our infrastructure, we take care of it. Again, it's new language, but is that a new practice?
No, that's also standard practice.
And then my final thing actually is a legal question. Section .120 on page 10 of the ordinance, page 75 of the packet. Matt, it has to do with the recording of the latecomer assessments. It says, upon recording, the latecomer agreement and an assessment shall be binding upon all property owners of record within the assessment reimbursement area. I'm wondering if that shouldn't say something like all property owners of record and their successors in interest. In other words, if they are no longer the owner a month later, is that new party equally bound? Shouldn't they be bound? Are they already bound in a way I don't understand? or?
They already are. And earlier in the statute, it talks about the recording with notice to all title. So the recording's against the property itself, just like a deed of trust or a mortgage. So it follows title, runs with the land. So that language in here that you just quoted is actually taken right from the RCW.
Okay, so we have no concern that it will keep applying?
That's correct.
Okay, great, thank you, that's very
We have a motion.
reassuring.
Any other questions, comments? We have a motion before us. All those in favor, answer aye.
Aye.
Okay, we will recommend approval to the full council tonight. Our next item is a bid award for the James Street at Abandoned Railroad Bridge replacement.
Excellent, thank you. A few council meetings previous to this, we came to council requesting full closure of James Street to accommodate this project. At that time, we were just preparing to go out to bid. So we've done that, and we're here today to recommend award to the lowest responsive and responsible bidder, which happens to be Ram Construction out of Bellingham. Obviously, we're very happy with the number when you look at it compared to the engineer's estimate. It was a bit of a miss on the engineer's estimate, but at least it was in a good way for the city. And I think the reason for that, and Craig can certainly speak to it in more detail than me, but when we provide our engineering estimates, one of the primary ways we come up with our numbers is to go back and look at previous work done in the city of Bellingham, and we look at unit costs and what we've paid for our public projects. And we look at a bridge construction like this, there's just not a lot of comparables of bridges of this size in this area. And so we relied on our consultant, and they've done a nice job for us, but their comparables were largely from the King County area and of projects that weren't exactly the same as this. So I think that's one reason why we saw the numbers being lower in this area, which looks like a good thing for us. We're confident in the contractor. It's been a good contractor for us, and we feel good about the number, and the contractor does as well. So with that, we recommend award, and we're anxious to finally move forward with this project.
Great. Yeah, just so people are aware that the difference between the estimate and the actual contract was $1,100,000. So that's a substantial savings, which I love. Jack, you had a question.
So Ted, what was, or Craig, what was the total amount that was budgeted out of that? You know, how much did we receive in TIB funds and federal funds compared to our street funds?
That's a good question. So unfortunately, the way this typically works, especially with TIB money, is TIB will look at our cost, and we'll work with them, and it will impact the amount of money eventually that we get through TIB. So likely, that funding from the state will be reduced based on our actual costs, and our local match, our local contribution will not go down as much. So the savings, unfortunately, won't go all to the city. It will be in the opportunity for that state funding to go elsewhere, and maybe to the city of Bellingham for a future project. But TIB, the way they do it is they award based on our projected costs, but they follow the project, and then they look at our project award, and they'll understand that there could be some overages, so they're not going to reduce it below the cost, but any savings will likely be found on the TIB side.
So what you're saying is that the street fund designate, or what we have budgeted for, encumbered for the street fund is going to basically stay the same regardless of what the cost is going to be?
That's probably the most likely scenario. I mean, we'll certainly work with the funding agencies, and there's, I think with this type of bid, it's likely that we won't expend all of our street fund money as well, but we're going to look at it. But typically when TIB is involved, they're wanting their project to be the capstone funding that allows the project to move forward, and you don't get an opportunity to reduce your local money and use all that state money.
One clarification, if I may. This is Craig Mueller, project engineer for Public Works. The TIB funds were initially to cover a project including the Woodstock Way intersection with James Street. That was broken up into two projects, primarily because Squalicum Creek currently flows underneath the Woodstock-James intersection. And in 2015, the creek will be rerouted out of that area and that channel abandoned. So if we do that segment as a later, call it a phase of this project, which is scheduled for 2016, then we can avoid having to completely redo the current existing Squalicum Creek culvert at a savings of about $500,000 to $1 million there, which is why it was broken up in the first place. But any additional funds, and I believe it comes out to be a little bit more than $300,000 in TIB funds that would basically be held in reserve and then could be used on that phase of the project, which is slated for 2016.
Great. Yeah.
Just to
Michael?
follow, he also asked about federal funds, the BRAC monies. Will be the same thing, we'll work with BRAC monies probably?
Yes, no, the BRAC funds are just for the bridge itself, and I believe that was 1.294 million.
But if the bridge component of the work goes down, the BRAC funding would also probably go down?
No, because there's still a significant local contribution for those. I mean, we have a construction cost of $2.5 million based on this bid, and 1.3 in BRAC funds. There's TIB funds and local funds, which are also a match for that. So there should not be any reduction in the BRAC funds.
Jack?
Move to approve.
Okay. Any other questions? Michael?
I just have a comment. Savings to the taxpayers is savings to the taxpayers. I'm just as happy to see the state save some money as I am, well, almost as happy to see the state save some money as well as us.
Okay. All those in favor of the motion, answer aye.
Aye.
Okay, we
And
will.
may I say
Yeah.
one more thing on this, just because this is broadcast? We are currently planning on beginning the closure of James Street the week of July 7th.
Okay, great.
So right after the holiday weekend, and that will be approximately 6 months.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very
Yes,
much.
Mayor. Yeah,
The letter from the port is in your box.
okay. Okay, before we start our next item, I have a request that we, from the city attorney, that we adjourn for a executive session to discuss possible litigation. We will recess for approximately 15 minutes, so we will return at 9:50. 9:40, I'm sorry. Yep. We are now adjourned. like to call the meeting back to order. We have come back from executive session, and we will report out the results of the executive session this evening. The next item before us is a work session on the Alabama corridor safety improvements. Ted?
Yes, thank you, Ted Carlson, Public Works Department. Back on April 7th, the City Council held a public hearing to hear the recommendations of the feasibility report. And maybe to take a step back, this project is a safety project along the Alabama corridor. And the project had two components. The first component was to really do an engineering report, a feasibility study to see what alternatives were out there to try to reduce accidents along the corridor. And it is a high accident corridor, both in terms of the numbers of accidents, but probably more importantly, the accident rates at some of the unsignalized intersections. So there was a series of public meetings and workshops and staff work along with consultants and other agencies, including WTA, the Council of Governments, who serves as the regional transportation planner. City staff included fire department, police department. So we really did try to take a complete look at the corridor and look at all of the ways in which the corridor functions and see how we can make improvements. Feasibility study recommended a series of alternatives throughout the corridor, and those alternatives vary because the corridor itself varies in terms of volumes and turning movements. We presented those recommendations to the public at a final public meeting, then came and had the public hearing with the council. We had a follow-up work session after the public hearing, largely to address some of the concerns that were raised at the public hearing, which centered around the center portion of the corridor through the Roosevelt neighborhood, and had to do primarily with the recommendation to install a C-curb, which would restrict left turn movements at the unsignalized intersections. And that's because when we evaluated the corridor, one of the primary causes of the high accident rates were left turning movements at areas where there was not a turn pocket. People were making that turn movement from a traveled lane and were subject to then rear end accidents or side swipe accidents where traveling public swerved around the stopped car to avoid them. And by putting in the turn restrictions, you eliminate that movement and you eliminate some of the challenges that go along with that movement. Many concerns were raised by the community, including the concern that putting the C-curb in would make it feel more like a main thoroughfare, potentially increasing speeds. We also heard that it would push additional volume onto the side streets, and there was concerns as to whether or not those residential streets could handle the additional volume. So staff came back at that work session and tried to address those concerns. Staff does feel like there are opportunities to address those concerns. Council directed us to go back and have another public meeting to primarily discuss the C-curb and one potential way to mitigate some of those concerns, which was to look at building east-north, a parallel route just to the north of Alabama that would provide secondary access to folks that live on one of four dead-end streets that are Queen, Undine, Racine, and Toledo. And so we did that. We went back out to the neighborhood and had a good turnout with the neighborhood, had an opportunity to talk to a lot of the folks. Several council members attended. And largely what we heard was continued opposition to the C-curb, that there were concerns that those concerns were certainly not going away, and that building east-north primarily, or the majority of the folks we talked to did not think that that was a viable way to mitigate. Although it may provide secondary access, they believe that many of their concerns about separating the neighborhood, impacts on Alabama from the C-curb resulting in higher speeds, all of the things that they had raised. They did not believe that east-north was a way to mitigate those. So what we've done is we went through the engineering report and looked at all of the data that came out of that, and we came up with our original recommendations. To be quite honest, we as staff have not heard anything throughout the process, although we've had a lot of dialogue and some good questions and good points that were raised that would really cause us to deviate from our recommendations. We believe that the C-curb still is the best, most proven way to mitigate the accidents through that corridor. In the interim, we've received accident data, and that's in your packet for 2012 and 2013, and the trend is continuing to be a high accident corridor, so we don't see any reason why that would change. But with that, we certainly heard concerns from the neighborhood. And what we'd like to do with council is provide you some options, some alternatives. And we have our recommendation, but there's other ways to do it, and we want to provide some options to what those might be. So in your packet, there's a memo that walks through some of those things, and we can go through that if you would like. I will like to just back up quickly and say, as you recall, the process is council makes some final decision on what the set of options, safety improvements will be, and those do need to go down to the state DOT for approval. That's part of the process. Once they approve those, then we can move forward with construction of those improvements, whatever they may be, and those improvements need to be constructed by the end of September 2015. So we're on track to do that. There's still time to do that. So maybe I can just quickly go down that alternative set of options for council's consideration.
That sounds good.
Okay, so kind of heading through that, first of all, the far west end of the corridor remains the same, and that was largely to go from a 4 to a 3-lane section with a series of pedestrian improvements and installation of bike lanes. We received positive feedback from the community on that. We still believe those are the best set of recommendations, so that area stays the same. But as we move to from James Street east, we would recommend that we continue to extend the C-curb. There's some proposed C-curb between James Street and through the interstate, King Street, in that area. We recommend that all stay, and the reason is there is secondary access to those folks. There's not any dead ends there where people don't have another way except for off Alabama, and we believe that those improvements are necessary and should remain. Really, as we go through, everything stays the same until we get to Pacific Street. Moving from Pacific Street east, what staff was proposing as a secondary set of options that council could consider is to not put the C-curb in through that center portion, but continue to do the pedestrian improvements, which are the crossings, with one exception and one additional change is that staff was recommending the installation of a full signal at St. Paul, and really the primary reason for that was if C-curbing was extended throughout that section of the corridor, it provided another turning movement there at St. Paul. Without the C-curbing, it is less important to have a full signal there. It's not warranted on its own. Just from turning movements, it was really warranted on a combination of the existing volumes and turning movements, but to provide another focused turning movements. Turning movements would have been increased at St. Paul because of the C-curb. So that intersection where we were proposing, or our recommendation is a signal, in this alternative set of options, that would become a hawk, which is a more than our existing enhanced crossings. It's a pedestrian actuated crossing that would provide a red signal for traveling public on Alabama. So replace the signal with a hawk. That is largely the difference through that section. There's enhanced crossings at other intersections. Those would remain the same. And then we go into some other things that could be considered by council, and that is to really just have a continued ongoing monitoring of the corridor. If WashDOT were to approve this alternative set of options that did not have the C-curb, we would want to continue to monitor the corridor, see if those improvements are having some safety benefit, and always have the option of moving in the future with C-curbing if the improvements that are put in don't prove to be successful enough. One of the other things we heard through the discussion with the neighborhood is that they were concerned that staff was focusing on Alabama, but there's some larger issues that should be considered, including volumes on Woburn, how Woburn interplays with Iowa, how it interplays with Sunset and the Sunset Crossing. And those are good points. Those are points that staff was very much aware of, that we need to look at the network as a whole. In the comprehensive plan, we've always known that in the out years, at some point, Woburn needs to be addressed, likely as volumes increase in the Barkley area. We're scheduled for development of the Barkley area. And so one of the things we would commit to do is work with the neighborhood as part of the upcoming comprehensive plan update, look at the neighborhood plan with them and make some larger recommendations as to how Alabama would function with Woburn and those parallel arterials. At the end of the day, one thing that we spend a lot of time talking about with the neighborhood is the difference between a secondary arterial, the way Alabama is classified and functions, and the notion of it as a residential street that bisects a neighborhood. That is true. It's a heavily used, high-volume secondary arterial that runs through a residential area. That's not ideal necessarily for some reasons, but that is how that street functions. From staff's perspective, it's not a residential street. It is an arterial street. That doesn't mean we don't want it to function in the safest way and try to interplay with the neighborhoods, but we can't really say, we don't believe as staff, we can say, let's do things to Alabama and make traffic go somewhere else. There is no somewhere else to go. There's only a few crossings of I-5. We can't expect to put all the traffic going east-west on Iowa or onto Sunset. Those are already stressed, and Alabama needs to carry its weight as a secondary arterial. That's the way it's designed and the way it functions. So we need to look at that as part of the comprehensive plan. Essentially, the big change in this other alternatives is to just delay on the C curb, do everything else, that modification at St. Paul, and just say that we'll continue to look at it and we'll look at the bigger picture as we look at transportation planning in the area. We don't know for certain whether or not WashDOT will approve that, but if council decides to go with something like that, we'll send it down to the DOT and we'll work with them and see what happens. C-curbs obviously is a very direct, very proven way to mitigate the accidents, and that's why that was the recommendation, but we certainly did hear the concerns. With that, certainly happy to have any discussion with council. Staff is here that can answer any technical questions that you may have. I know Rick Nicholson is here from WTA, who certainly was very involved in the process, so if there's questions about transit or anything like that. Oh, I will mention that we had proposed some changes to bus stops to help the corridor function, relocation, consolidation. All of that can still move forward regardless of whether or not a C-curb is installed in that center section.
Okay, thank you, Ted. Before we start, I really want to thank staff for going that extra step to go meet with the neighborhood and hear the concerns, but I really feel that was important. As well, when you mentioned about going back to do that because of concerns from the neighborhood, one of the reasons, for the record, that this committee recommended going back to talk was also concerns that have been expressed by the council about the possible safety concerns for the neighborhood of the increased danger of routing more traffic through the quiet residential streets where many that don't have sidewalks, children play in there, and the concerns for that as well. So where it might be a little safer with the C-curbs on the Alabama Hill, on the Alabama Street, some of us felt that there would increase the danger for the residents in those quiet streets. And, the thought of because there's a lot of children that play on those streets and there's not sidewalks and stuff, is it's pretty quiet. And the thought of one child being run over because of increased traffic, we felt merited the need to look at this a little more. And so I just wanted to make sure, it wasn't just the neighborhoods expressing it, it had been some of the council members as well when we put that. So I'll now open it up for discussion with the council. Michael.
Well, first, Terry, I agree with you. What would happen on the side streets would be a vehicle-pedestrian interaction. It may be slow motion, but still quite damaging, as opposed to a higher speed auto accident on Alabama. I don't like either option, but I want to think about both. We have a quick question, though, that has to do, how many hawks are there now? If we would take that one intersection and make it, and we make that a hawk instead, are we up to 3 or 4 hawks now along the entire section?
I'm going to let Chris take that.
Good morning, Council. Changing the recommendation for a traffic signal at St. Paul to a hawk would mean 4 hawk signals along the corridor. Remember, our recommendation is to take the existing flashing crosswalk at St. Paul and pick it up and move it to Ellis Street. So in grand total, there's 5 new crossings on the corridor, but this one would become a hawk rather than a traffic signal.
Just for those that might be watching, could you explain what a hawk is?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Well,
Yeah,
just
so-
for those that are watching, we know some of the terminology, but could you explain what a hawk is? Because
Yeah, so I think most people are probably familiar with our enhanced crosswalks, which are, a crosswalk that has a mask going out over the street with amber flashing lights that's activated by a pedestrian when they want to cross the street. Very similar. A hawk has that same pedestrian activation, but it's red lights instead of amber. So from a driver going on Alabama, it functions as a signal that fully stops them. Rather than an amber, which is caution, it's a red light. We don't have any in the city of Bellingham right now. They are popping up in the nearby areas, and it's just another layer of protection for the pedestrians. It will be a little bit new for us, and we'll be working at how we interplay those with our fully activated signals so that as you go through the corridor, there's some continuity there. But it's another higher level of protection that we recommend as we move forward when you're crossing 4 lanes of traffic. And so it's something that we think will be successful, but we haven't installed them yet.
okay, Jack?
Operationally, with a amber signal, if a pedestrian's going across, once they've crossed the center line, I guess state laws allows people to continue traveling through. With hawks, if you get a red signal, is it timed such that is it a timed signal that allows the pedestrian to move all the way through, and does traffic stop on both sides, waiting for that traffic pattern to go, to go through its cycle?
The difference is if you've got a flashing signal, you are allowed to proceed, but if it's a solid signal, you're not allowed to proceed. So when the solid goes away and becomes flashing or just goes away, the cars can proceed, but when it's solid, they cannot.
And so how does that work with the hawk then?
The hawk signal operationally works, a pedestrian activates the signal, there's a flashing red signal, then it goes to a solid red, and that literally stops the traffic. And as long as it's solid, no cars can move through the crossing. But when the solid goes away, they can proceed, like you see cars doing now with the flashing yellow. Once the pedestrian has crossed out of the lanes, they can proceed with a flasher.
Does a hawk show green? In other words, the way the enhanced crosswalks work is they're amber or nothing. Would a hawk to the traffic show either flashing red, or green, or does it just go away?
Once the pedestrian activates the
Yeah.
crossing, it starts to flash red
But
for a few
afterwards,
seconds.
when it resets, does it actually have an active green light?
I
or
think
no
there's
light?
different ways to program them. The ones that I've actually used down, say, in Skagit County, they actually don't have a flasher afterwards. The solid simply goes away.
But
No
is
green.
it replaced by a green?
There's no green.
No
It's just
green.
it's all red.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just goes
Okay, so
away.
back to my question though, is it when the hawk red light is on all the time, when it's a continuous, is that timed for having a pedestrian go across all 4 lanes or just 2 lanes, or how's that timed?
It would be all 4, and all of these have to be brought up to ADA standards, and there's very specific requirements for number of seconds that have to be provided given the number of lanes being crossed.
It'd be a minimum of like 20 to 30 seconds then.
It's 3.5 feet per second is the standard.
Yeah, but it brings up a point that these will be new in the city, so there'll be some education for folks, and we'll work with people on that. But yeah, you won't be able to proceed once the pedestrians pass through the 2 lanes in your traveling direction. You need to stop because it'll be a solid red. You just like running a red light if they went at that point.
Okay, Michael?
Well, as I said at the beginning, when this first was hearing, 85-90% of this has got broad support, and now I think we're much closer to 100%. It improves safety, usability, traffic flow, the backing up at intersections that'll be improved, pedestrian safety. The bus stops are being removed for more pedestrian safety. But I guess they're asking for a direction right now. I think this is the sort of thing that I don't know if we want to make a recommendation that the whole council discuss it. I'm favoring the new recommendation, but I don't know if the rest of the council want to be part of the discussion or they want to hear a recommendation from us. I don't know.
Well, we have this committee formed because this committee are the folks who are supposed to be the experts on, and this is our specialty, on public safety, public works. Okay. If I was the rest of the council, I would want this committee to make a recommendation and then have a full discussion, because that's what our roles are. That's what I view our roles are. Jack?
Yeah, I would be comfortable having the committee make a recommendation to the council.
Right.
I do have, I guess, a question in light of what's in the report and what you and I had talked about, Ted, about a week ago or so in preparation of this report. And one of the items that I saw that was missing out of here was signage for no left turn during drive times. And
Right.
wanting to, it sounds like there's a decision there that was
Well,
made.
yeah, we had a good conversation. What Jack's talking about is posting some signage throughout the corridor that would say something like no left turn during PM peak hours 4 to 6 or something like that. And we've talked quite a bit about that. And I think it's something we could still pursue at the intersections where there's hawks or crossings. We'd have a mast arm to post it. The reality of it is we got caught up in just the logistics of posting those signs. There are so many crossings. So you have, normally where you see that, you see it a lot in Seattle. It's generally used more as a capacity, a way to increase capacity so you don't have people stopping in a travel lane during peak hours when they're trying to really get people out of town. But one of the very challenges with Alabama is there's so many access points. How many are there throughout the corridor?
I think the entire quarter, there's over 80.
Yeah, so that with between alleys and minor streets and all these things, that's the problem. So we started talking about how would you even post that so that it was enforceable. You have so many people coming onto the corridor at different spots. To put signage in a way that you could legitimately say everyone had an opportunity to see the signage so that they knew that lefts were prohibited, you would have to put them so often it would just be signs down the whole corridor hanging from wires or something. One of the things we talked about is maybe you could do it at those major intersections or at those crossings where you have a mast arm out over the street. You could just add a sign to it. Would certainly be clear that you couldn't take a left at that intersection during PM peak or something. Honestly, that's what it came down to, Jack, was how do you even sign it in a way that doesn't put the police department in a position where it's really not enforceable, because it would be too easy to say, well, I came onto the corridor and I never saw that sign. So we're not ruling it out as a potential way to maybe deter people from making a left or even prohibit it if it's posted clearly. We just didn't, after discussion, want to put it in here because we just logistically couldn't figure it out. It's interesting because when we were there's a couple challenges with all the access points. Someone had said at one of the public meetings, well, why don't you look at reversible lanes, something like that. You've got heavy flow one direction in the PM, heavy flow the other direction in the AM. And it was an interesting point, but the problem again is access. There's too many access points to appropriately sign and control that. You see those on freeways or limited access because it's easy to control. So we're not ruling it out as a potential option, but it just was very challenging to figure out how to do it. So we didn't want to put it in here and not be able to figure it out.
Because, admittedly, there are some problems in trying to make a left turn during drive time.
Yeah.
That's, I think, the main
That's
reason
what it
why
is,
you're doing this. And I
Right.
think the accident count kind of underscores the issue. And to me, it seems like, if we do remove the C curbs under this particular alternative, that we would need to have something in its place to at least deal with the drive time, which, if it's 20 or 22 hours out of an entire day
Right.
of driving, that we are able to mitigate the worst of the worst when it comes to collision data.
Yeah, I think we thought it was, obviously we don't know how effective they would be, but we thought it might be something worth doing. And at those places where we can figure out how to post it and where it's clear, I think we would still pursue that.
In looking at the alternatives of whether to go with one or the other with this, there are a lot of factors to look at. One of the things we don't know is if we go with the alternative option, and we're going to have a lot of traffic calming devices in there with the lights, with the pedestrian lights and other things, where people are going to be really watching, those that are used to traveling through there. That alone is going to start making people more aware going through there. Will the safety issues that are, the changes on Alabama, will that, without all the C curves, will that get us there? You know, to the point that we're looking at, given the other traffic calming devices and stuff? You know, that's something we don't know, and it may very well, that by itself might very well get us there, as well as preserving the safety of the residents in the side streets. I think if we were to go with the alternative, it would be with the idea that we would do continuing monitoring of Alabama, the neighborhoods, to see how this works as we go into the future, knowing that maybe we need more. But we don't know that right now. We can say, yes, we throw all of this out there and that will, you know, give us the maximum amount of safety, but we might get the same thing by going with the alternatives. And so I do have, you know, I've went through a lot of discussions in the past. I've been on the council long enough to know concerns of different neighborhoods at different times about increased traffic going through the neighborhoods and the increased danger that sometimes poses. In a lot of different neighborhoods, we have, you know, the Fairhaven neighborhood. I mean, come on, we blocked that right off. Parts of York Street we've kept from drive-through traffic because we were having safety problems with that. And right now, to route people through the existing neighborhoods where it could increase some problems, you know, I'd like to actually go with the alternative and see how that works into the future. So, you know, and then monitor it. I'd be inclined to do that. Jack?
Yeah, I'm with you on that, Terry, and I also agree with your issues about the safety concerns of the side streets. You know, this does seem to be a mechanism that we can, I think, get the best bang for the buck. The only thing that I look at this that you know, outside of the signage issue for drive time, the only other issue that I feel like would be appropriate to realize under all of these improvements, it has to do with speed limit. And I think that having 35 miles an hour on a secondary arterial going through this type of activity of having multiple intersections, multiple checkpoints for pedestrian crossings, you know, the various hawks, you know, you're going along 35 miles an hour, which also means that you're probably going between 42 and 45 miles an hour, and all of a sudden there's going to be a flashing red light. You know, that to me, I think, is going to be a problem, especially with people bombing down Alabama Hill. To me, it seems like the effective speed limit will be reduced a lot with having all of these different improvements, and it will even, there'll be a perception even that we'll have to go slower because of all of these different signals and cross arms and various infrastructure improvements that are going on, and whatever. We're doing bulb outs too in places.
There's only one bulb out recommended. That's on Xenia Street to deal with a cut-through traffic problem.
Okay. So anyway, all of those issues, to me, it seems like the effective speed limit will be reduced. And I understand that staff wants to do an engineering design. To me, I would rather, for safety purposes, I would rather choose a lower speed limit now with the onset of all of these improvements than to put the improvements in there with 35 miles an hour and then somehow later on come in and figure out whether or not that's an appropriate speed limit. I would rather err on the safe side and do a modification to speed limit now than to keep the status quo where we're making all of these changes and really changing the whole feel of that street. I think we really need to also change the speed limit. And for what I would like to propose is, I'd like to propose 25 miles an hour, which is in line with what we do with other principal arterials as well as secondary arterials that I think, I used Northwest a few weeks ago as a perfect example of a street that is, very comparable in design and has much fewer intersection points than what Alabama is going to have or already currently has, and that's 25 miles an hour. And I just feel like, it would be an appropriate thing, knowing what the collision data is for pedestrians at 25 miles an hour versus 35 miles an hour when it comes to the possibility of severe injury or death. To me, it just seems like 25 miles an hour is the appropriate speed limit to at least to consider.
One of the things I've noticed, I've been driving on Alabama quite a bit lately just to check it out at different times. And I think with these traffic calming issues happening and with traffic, I think you're right. One of the things you will see during prime drive time and when it's heavier traffic, people will be driving slower because they'll need to be driving slower. But if you drive that in the evenings, you don't have anywhere near that kind of traffic. The flow goes through there pretty well, and I don't think you have the issue with the speed so much with that. The other will automatically, I think, with it will slow traffic down. So I'm not sure if we need to make those changes initially, but I would almost prefer having that as one of our items to monitor and look at, and if we need to, try that change, and then, before we do the monitor to put the C curve in. I'm just yeah.
Before Michael gets it,
Right.
can I just a
Yes,
quick
you can.
discussion on that?
I'm just,
I understand your
Right,
point,
and
but as far as nighttime driving or off-peak time driving, I mean, you could say that's the very same thing about any other road that, for instance, Northwest, there's you have intersection points every half mile. And I grew up in LA, and we had the same type of situations where there were half-mile blocks, and the speed limits were 45 in those blocks. Some of them were even up to 50.
Yeah.
And, so does that mean that, we should change Northwest to 45 miles an hour? So that, the effective speed limit during drive time is going to be 25, but, we could change the speed limits on a number of our streets and increase it during the off times, but we don't because we keep.
You hit the optimal thing, though, change. And right now, we have that existing, and if we're looking at going forward and monitoring,
Yeah, I guess I would want to monitor on the safe side than on the.
Michael?
Couple comments. Terry, you're saying in the evening when the traffic is down, maybe 35 is a more reasonable speed. What I'm hearing happens in the evening when traffic is down is that's when you're more likely to get people going 45 miles an hour. I mean, there are speeding problems, and I don't think they occur at 4:30 p.m. I think they occur at 8:30 p.m. Well, but the point is 45 is unsafe, and, I guess, Jack, I don't want to go as far as you. I think I agree with you. If this is safety-driven, and one of the things we can do, not necessarily to eliminate accidents, but to decrease the harm, the fatality or injury potential for an accident, is to reduce the speed limit. Ted provided me with some language from the report, the feasibility study. And that technical analysis found that lowering posted speed limit in Alabama from 35 to 30 would not result in appreciably greater travel times from one end of the corridor to the other, and would not result in negative impact on WTA transit or typical vehicle traffic. Lowering the posted speed to 25 miles per hour would require noticeably greater travel time for vehicle traffic and would negatively impact on-time performance for WTA buses. I think this whole corridor here is, Ted was talking about it. It's an arterial segment of a residential area. It's a compromised, I think, Ted, you said, not an ideal situation. So similarly, 25 might be a great speed limit viewed one way and 35 the proper speed limit viewed another. I'm of the mind that the study shows 30 miles an hour works as an arterial, so I would like to lower the speed limit as part of the package of improvements made now, and then monitor and see how 30 works. So I have a third proposal.
Okay.
Do I hear any motions?
Well,
I
here-
move that we recommend a 30-mile-an-hour speed limit reduction as part of the change to be made immediately and then monitored.
Okay, discussion?
Can I ask for an amendment to not 30 miles an hour, but to recommend to the council tonight that we would lower the speed limit and have the discussion about what the number is with the rest of the council and with the staff?
That's fine. That's fine, because we're going to have to discuss it with the full council anyway. If we move it forward to this evening for discussion, that's fine. So we can move the new set of recommendations the committee can forward the current things with a recommendation, and then also move forward on a vaguer recommendation on this one element. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, but did you just move the entire alternative?
No, I didn't.
Okay, just the speed limit is what your motion has to do.
That's what I just did.
Okay.
If no one minds, I will go ahead and amend my own motion. I recommend this evening I move that we recommend this evening to the full council consideration of the new alternative to remove...
Wait. Because now you're bringing in a completely other motion.
I want to do two things.
Okay, but you made a motion about speed limit.
I can amend my own motion. If you don't like it,
Okay, well, I'm concerned about Marie here.
okay.
We haven't had any seconds, so.
Well, we don't
need
need
a-
seconds.
I know, that's why
Yeah.
it makes it easier, so
Well,
if he's
let's just,
withdrawing it. then-
let's just vote on my now revised version, only do a speed limit. That this evening, we recommend including a reduction in speed limit as part of the initial changes to be made on Alabama Street Corridor. Just vote on that.
It's just the speed limit, that's your motion.
Just the speed limit and just reducing without indicating a number.
Okay, we have a motion, any other comments? We have a motion before us. All those in favor of the motion, answer aye.
Aye.
Okay, we'll recommend approval with that. Michael?
Second motion, I move that we recommend to the full council this evening that we approve the amended proposal that the staff has brought forward to remove the C-curb and change the that one lighter intersection to a hawk instead in that middle portion of Alabama.
Okay, any other comments?
The alternative improvements as
The
presented.
alternative
The
improvements?
alternative as
Okay.
suggested.
No comments? All those in favor, answer aye.
Aye.
Okay, we will recommend approval of that to the council tonight. Yes, Mayor.
Thank you. May I make a request that when we're going to add something, I know you two, others, council members have talked about the speed limit and potential impacts, and Michael's read the comments from the Public Works Director, but potentially when something hasn't been discussed yet at the committee hearing, that we have an opportunity for the staff to give some information to the council.
Yeah, they can always do that. I didn't see any
Oh, no, that's
looking
fine.
like they wanted
I mean,
to.
it's
Yeah,
okay, but
okay.
I think sometimes that happens, it's better if
Yeah.
it happens before we vote on it rather than after we vote on it.
Yeah, and just,
Okay.
staff has responded to this before,
Yeah,
and
right.
so our recommendation is on the speed limit, and we did look at it in the feasibility report, as Michael mentioned, to do the improvements first, then do an engineering study to see what the appropriate speed limit is. I think we largely agree with a lot of what Jack said, is that with some of the improvements in terms of additional crossings, it could certainly have a slowing effect on the corridor, and it could result in legitimately reducing the speed limit. We looked at 30 because transit is definitely a concern in that corridor, and we don't see a situation where it would go below 30 and still function the way transit needs it to function, and emergency services and the rest of the traveling public. But our recommendation remains the same, is that we would look at it afterwards. The one thing I would say is whatever council decides to do, one thing we'll have to do with the speed limit, if the direction is to lower it at the same time we do improvements, is to maybe look at the limits of the speed limit in terms of the, do we want to start it over at Electric and take it all the way to Cornwall? Rather than just the project limits, would it make sense to lower it all the way over to the terminus of Alabama? That, and I'll talk with Eric before tonight to see whether or not, we would say, if you're going to do that, let's do it all the way throughout that whole corridor length. So we'll have more discussion with the full council on that.
Okay. I believe that's the last item before us, unless there's anything, old or new business or anything that the council wants brought up. Okay, this committee is now adjourned.